So Shengen asked me to talk about the evolving patterns of regional development. First, I give you a snapshot, some photos in Shanghai. So many people have been to Shanghai, to China. They found Shanghai has more tall buildings than New York City. If you go there, you feel China is more like a modern world as the US. But if you travel to the west, you can easily find places like this. These are one of our survey sites, survey villages in Guizhou province. It's about 2 hours away from Guiyang, the capital city of Guizhou. So you can see extreme poverty. 30% of people still donate blood as a major cash income. And more than 30% of people, males, couldn't afford to get married. So this is a snapshot. And not only regional inequality in income has increased. In fact, the other social indicators also show a large regional variation. Here we use look at most recent indicators in infant mortality rate in 2005. You can observe a large regional divide between the east and the west, the coast and inland. Basically, the east is the coast, and the west is inland. You can see large difference. In Shanghai, the infant mortality rate is about 3 person per 1,000 people. In Tibet, it's 73. Overall, the rural-urban divide in infant mortality rate is about 2, and so is the inland coast divide. You can see the social indicators mirror closely the economic development patterns. So this is a snapshot. The question is, how have regional disparities in the different dimensions evolved in the last 6 decades? For this is a very difficult study because lack of data. Professor Carl Riskin, I think, initiated one of the largest survey work on this issue. They have done surveys in 88, 95, 2002, 2005. Professor Riskin is the principal investigator on this. But this is still only a civil snapshot. In order to look at the long-run patterns, we need to look for some other sources, because China never released the household-level data at the national level. Here, we use publicly released per capita consumption data at the provincial level with a rural-urban divide. So each province has a rural component and an urban component. So each year, we have about 60 observations. And then we can use these 60 observations to calculate the overall regional inequality and also divide it into rural-urban inequality and inland coastal inequality. So these are major approach and data. So we are measuring inequality at the regional level, remember. It's not at the individual level. Rural-urban and the inland coastal inequality are the two key dimensions. So if you look at the figure, you can see 2 patterns. First of all, the dashed line represents rural-urban disparity. The numbers are higher than the blue line, which stands for inland coastal inequality. In terms of levels, rural-urban gap is much bigger than inland coastal gap. This one. Secondly, you look at the trend. Inland coastal inequality growing much faster than rural-urban gap. You look at the whole period. For a long period between 1950 and 1980, inland coastal inequality was rather minimal, and then take off since the 80s. So these are 2 characteristics of the China's regional inequality. But if you study the new classical growth theory, it will predict regional convergency. The reason is simple. If you assume perfect market, laborers can freely move around to look for higher wage rate, and the capital go to the places with higher returns as well, you will see the convergency, regional convergency. But what I showed in the earlier graph, we observe a divergency. So here we want to argue is that development strategies and economic policies matter a lot to the observed spatial patterns, the government has responded to different external and internal environment to adopt different policies, and which in turn influence the regional development patterns. So before going to relate the economic policies and regional development patterns, we first have a very brief walkthrough of the Chinese economic history in the past 6 decades. When China was established in 1949, it faced a very hostile international environment, a trade blockade. It was its only trade partner with former Soviet Union bloc. So the China really was influenced by former Soviet Union. At that time, the heavy industry development strategy dominated. So they adopted that strategy. And in mid-50s, when China broke the relationship with some Union, they actually intensified their desire to catch up with other countries. They want to have more steels, more heavy industries, to make more weapons, and maybe to defend the potential threat from former Soviet Union and other Western countries. So this is a rationale that China at that time used the heavy industry development strategy. But it has big consequence on development and on distribution patterns. First of all, China at that time had a lot of surplus labor, but very limited capital. In order to finance the labor-intensive heavy industry such as steel, it has to extract as much resources from the agriculture sector. In order to do that, they want to keep as many laborers as possible in villages. So they adopt the so-called hukou system, household registration system, to confine rural residents in the place of their birth. So when people born there, they are supposed to work in the same village and only engage in agricultural production. At that time, mainly in the collective farming. So they had a large literature document the efficiency of the collective farming, the free rider problem, all this. So by the late 70s, China was at the verge of collapse. China at that time imported a lot of grain, and people were afraid of another famine which may come. So they initiate the reform. It's also because of the crisis. So in the late 70s, China adopted a radical rural reform. The main policy is to abolish the inefficient collective farming and grant farmers land user right, 30 years user right. So allow farmers to make their own production decisions instead of going to the small teams, production teams, to listen to production leaders. It turned out it's a huge boost to the agricultural productivity. Both agricultural yield and rural income doubled in just 5 years. So if you look at the rural-urban disparity and the heavy industry development strategy indicator, you see they move rather closely until the rural reform period. The HIDS is heavy industry development strategy. It's measured by the share of heavy industry gross output value in total industry gross output value. And this is the solid line. You can see there are two major peaks in the regional rural-urban gap. One is in the Great Leap Forward, one is in the end of Cultural Revolution. And if you look at the HIDS, also have several peaks. They corresponded very well. So at least up to the mid-1980s, the national development strategy is rather consistent with the observed rural-urban gap. So the large rural-urban gap is was mainly caused by the heavy industry development strategy. So this is one major conclusion from our previous studies. I said after the rural reform, China also decided to open up. At that time, there are 4 words in Chinese. One is reform, one is opening up. So the Mr. Deng's, at that time, the slogans. Also, he had a very famous saying, allow some people to get rich first. Also allow some regions to get rich first. So there's unbalanced development strategy at that time, they realized actually the coast regions enjoyed a comparative advantage because cheap labors, proximity to other more developed economies like Hong Kong, Taiwan, Japan. So as long as you open the border, immediately the foreign investment will come in. They will relocate their firms to the regions. You will expect this, just a small change in the strategy largely stimulate the economic growth in the coastal region. Meanwhile, China also gave a lot of preferable policies to the coast area. They set up economic development zones, like in Shenzhen, and later on in early 90s, Shanghai. So you can see the coast area. The bottom is Shenzhen, the special zone close to Shanghai, close to Hong Kong, and then the circle above is Shanghai. So the photo you show in Pudong in our first photograph, it was used to be the paddy field 20 years ago. They were all built up in the last 20 years. After the Pudong, one of the districts in Shanghai was earmarked as a special economic zone. You can see the big impact of the policy change. And if you look at the indicators, inland coastal disparity and a measure of openness, that is trade ratio, trade volume in total GDP, you can see across the whole period, there's co-movement of the two series. In econometry terms, called co-integration. Although each line is not stationary in econometry in time series terms, but if you look at their movement, if you look at the difference between these two lines, the residuals are rather stationary. It's more like a drunk man with a dog. Although the drunk man may move very randomly, their distance is rather narrow. So you can see, if you run the econometry test, you can still find a strong co-movement between the series. This suggests that openness does matter to the observed rapid increase in inland coastal disparity, in particular since the economic reform. In addition to giving farmers the incentive, the Chinese government also tried to give more incentives to local government. So one key instrument is the fiscal decentralization. The idea is to tie local revenues to local expenditures and force local government to work hard to develop the local economy so they can benefit more. So this creates a very strong yardstick competition among local officials because China is still a centralized, merit-based government system. The upper-level government try to reward the officials, promote them based on their GDP performance and other economic indicators. So by tying the revenues to expenditures, also by putting the GDP growth rate in their contract, create a very strong incentive, a growth mania incentive to develop local economy. But it has also very strong distributional consequence because for some regions, without strong revenue base and this kind of competition, they will lose out. The firms may move to the coastal regions. That's what we observed in the last 30 years. Actually, there's a capital flow from inland to the coast to seek better investment environment, lower tax rate. So if you look at the overall regional inequality and decentralization, once again, you see a very clear co-movement between them. So this is the general patterns between development strategies, openness, decentralization, heavy industry development strategy. You can see they are really correlated to each other. Just an update, in the last several years, there's a Go West strategy. They started in 1999. They tried to have much more massive infrastructure investment in the West to have highways, railroad linked to the West. And also they set up Chongqing as a provincial level city. And also they have other regional strategies, Reading Central, reinvigorate Northwest. Also set up Tianjin as a special zone. Like you can Chongqing, right now you have 4 major economic zones. You can see that. And recently they called a new socialism countryside or harmonious society. They abolished agricultural taxation, provide subsidies to farmers, waive tuition of education, etc. So now the question is that, can the current strategies help reduce regional inequality? If we look at the most recent year data, since 2005, it seems regional inequality has nosed down. Actually, Professor Carl Riskin first noticed that. I remember in 2005, 2006 in Oxford, he was the first to suggest actually the Western development strategy may work. And the regional inequality actually leveled off according to his data at that time. If you look at the trend, hopefully there's a downward trend. So Ravi will go and talk about the policy options.